Hello, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of the UiPath Apps to Data Service Integration video series. My name is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to go right to the concept that's at the heart of this video series, and that's the direct integration of UiPath apps with data service. So let me start from the beginning. I'm going to go back to the main page. And if I click on this link, it brings me to this survey landing page. A company is trying to gather information on technology users on what is their favorite skill at any given point in time, and what are the number of days in a week that they spend to improve or build up their expertise in that skill. It's pretty simple. So the user receives an email and the user navigates to this form. And if it's the first time for that user on this form here, the user clicks, "This is my first time here." Clicking on the link takes the user to a very simple form, and the user puts in the first name, the last name, and then the preferred skill. For example, let's say project management, and the number of days spent in a week. So obviously it starts from as low as 0.1 days of the week to 7 days in a week. So I put in, let's say 3, and then I hit save. So what the user gets in return is a unique response ID. And that response ID is made up of a username that the system generated based on the first and last name entered by the user and a unique identifier. Now this is built using UiPath expressions and functions, and we'll get to that. But what the user can do with this ID is they have the ability to go back and view their responses. And before the survey ends, they could go back and change their responses to the survey. And also, if they want to remove a response to this survey, they can go and delete that response. From this form, the user has got 3 options. One is the user can still stay on this page, clear out the responses and submit yet another response, or go back to the main page, in which case everything is going to be reset. The third option is the user can go back to the survey homepage. Now, if the user clicks on back to survey homepage, the user is brought back to the form from where they started. Now here, if the user wants to take a look at a specific response, let us say I want to take a look at this response that I just submitted. I enter the entire key, and when I click on it, it takes me to a survey manager. And in this survey manager, the user has the option to view the response and also add another response, which we just saw a few minutes ago, or edit a specific response or delete a specific response. So if I want to look at just the one response, I can put in the entire key. But if I want to look at all my responses, I go back to survey homepage and I can put in just the part of the key that I received. So I'm going to put in just a part of my user key, and then I go in and click go to my responses. And in this case, you can see that there are several responses that I have submitted as part of this survey. And that's pretty much how this application works. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to begin working with data service in order to build an application such as this, and also look at how this particular interface has been built. And in the next video, we are going to be building upon this application to complete the edit response functionality and also the delete response functionality. This brings us to the prerequisites. So for that, I'm going to go into my data service instance. And in my data service instance, I have already created an entity named preferred skill profile. And this entity has got about 6 fields that I have added to this entity. And you don't have to create this entity from scratch, because what I have done is I have exported the entity out and created a JSON import file. And I'm going to be sharing that along with the app. And you can pull this JSON file in to create this entity. I've already tested it and I pulled it in with a different entity name, and you can see it works. But the only drawback for using this approach is the descriptions of the fields are not pulled in when you import a JSON file in. And it has been acknowledged as a bug because I reported it to UiPath, and that will be fixed. But it should not stop you from creating this entity or working with this entity in data service. Obviously, the first name, last name, favorite skill, and days of the week were demonstrated when we covered the form at the beginning of this video. What's different here is there is a survey ID. Obviously, the survey ID is the parent ID of this survey, because every survey has a unique ID, and multiple responses from multiple users are all grouped under that survey ID. But in this case, I've simply hard-coded it to a fixed number, so we are not going to be covering that. The response ID is this ID that you saw from earlier. Every response from the user is going to be recorded with this unique response ID. And to make it very clear, the response ID is not the internal ID of the data service entity record. So I want to make that very clear. So if we go to the data section, you can see I have many number of records, and each of them has got a unique response ID. And as I mentioned earlier, it has been generated using UiPath functions and expressions. And that's pretty much what it takes for you to get started as far as the data service side of the equation is concerned. Now that we have created our data service entity, the next thing for us to do is to pull in that entity into our UiPath App Studio environment. And to pull in the entity, we go to the properties of the app here, hit plus, and select the entity preview feature. And obviously, we are connected to the same instance of the automation cloud in which the data service is created. And therefore, this App Studio environment will have access to the entity you just created. Now, in this case, I've already pulled in the preferred skill profile entity. But when you're going to be doing this for the first time, you will see your entities listed here, and then you select the entity that you need to pull in. And as soon as you select the entity, you will be presented with a list of the information on that entity. And then to complete the process, you click add. Now, I'm not going to do that because I've already pulled in the entity I need. So I hit cancel. But once you have completed pulling in the entity, you scroll down on the left. Under the entity section, you will be able to see your data service entity that is made available for you in the App Studio. So going on the right, some of the properties that are covered here are the internal name of the entity, and also the number of fields and the records that are currently available in the backend data service. So this is the first step in integrating your UiPath app directly with data service. Next, we go to the form that we saw at the beginning of this video and directly jump in to the functionality that will help us create an entity record. Now, you already saw that when the user inputs this information and all the validations are clarified, the save button is enabled. And when the user clicks on the save button, the entity is created and the message box, which is a text area box, is made visible when the entity is successfully created in the backend data service. So this text area box has got its hidden attribute being controlled by an expression, and it is bound to this variable here called var status message. And that var status message is used in this expression so that this text area box becomes visible when the var status message variable is populated with the success message. Next, to create the entity, what we do is we look in to the click event of the save button. So I go to the save button, click on events and click edit rule. And obviously, this has been covered in the part 1 video. The form has to be validated before the entity can be created. So we are going to stream past all of those steps here. And at this point, if the form is not valid, then there is an error message that our submission process has failed. If not, we proceed to the next step to generate the new response ID, the unique response ID that I spoke to you about at the beginning of the video. And this ID is generated with a combination of the first and last names and a unique ID. And for that, we use the set values action, and the variable var response ID will be populated using the concat function and the GUID function. So basically what we're doing is we're taking the first name entered by the user, the last name, and then invoking the GUID function to generate a unique ID and concatenating all 3 elements to give us the var response ID. So now we have all the information that we need to create the entity record. So I already have that step here, but I'm going to show you how to create one from scratch. So I'm going to add one step here, and it's create an entity record. Next, you select the entity that you need, and I hit equal to, double click. And once I refer to that entity, then the mandatory fields and the optional fields are populated here for us to map the values from the app on the right. So here you can see that the mandatory fields have got this red asterisk symbol indicating that these are required, and the optional ones do not. So mapping this is pretty easy because we know the form variables. So for example, for day of the week, and pick the variable that is associated with that control, days of week spent. And then favorite skill is, of course, the selected value of the static list control, var list static selected. And first name is again pretty much straightforward. And so you get the idea on how you can map the data service entity fields on the left with the local form variables on the right. Now, once you have already done that, the next thing would be to create the steps when the create or the update operation completes successfully. So what I'll be doing is I'll be deleting this step because that's confusing. And I'm going to go back to the step that's already existing here. And in the created update success step, you can see that the var status message will be concatenated with the text and also the unique response ID that you saw in the front end when the user first submits a response and gets the unique ID back. And then once this variable is populated with this value, the text area control becomes visible on the front end. Now on error, a simple failure message is displayed in a message box stating that the response could not be recorded. So that's how simple it is to create a data service entity record through the UiPath app. Now the same step will be used to also update an existing entity record, and we'll cover that in the next video. So the next step for us is to build the interface that's going to help the user view their responses. So if I enter the key here, you can see that this button is activated only if there is some information entered. So when I click on the Go Responses, I am here on this interface and my data is displayed. Here is the main form, and the text input field is bound to a variable named var input response key. And once the user submits the information and clicks on this button opens up the next form and passes the information of this variable to a second variable that will be used to display the records. So if I now click on the go to my responses events and edit rule, so what this form does is it takes the value entered by the user in var input response key and assigns it to another variable named var input lookup key. And we'll come to this variable when we get to the table control, and then opens up the survey manager page. And the survey manager page is where the user will see all the responses for their username. So I'm going to open up the survey manager page. And here we have all the actions required for the user to manage the responses. And the main feature of this page is the table control. So I've already built this out in the way I want, and I'll show you how to build this from scratch. And what I'll do first is within this empty container, I'm going to add display table. I'm going to drag in the table control. Now this is the table control in its basic form. It isn't bound to anything yet. So the first thing we'll be doing is going to the data source property, start with the equal to sign, select the entity. Now, as soon as we do that, it's going to show us the fields of the underlying entity, but it's not going to be in the order that we want. And if you look at the order of these fields here, they are in the alphabetical order of the names of the fields in the entity. So that's not really what we want. Instead, we want to build something like this. There are two ways to actually add the columns the way you want them to be presented to your users. The first way is to go back to the property of this control, the table control. And so I click on, and here you can see all those automatically added fields. We can delete each one of them by hitting remove field and then add them back in the order we need them. The other way is to overwrite whatever's been added here by rebinding the fields in the order you need them. So how do I do that? I go to days of the week. I delete the days of the week, and I want to bind it instead to the first name. I'm going to click first name. Now, as soon as you do that, the column name will also change. And therefore, you see what you have done now, you have replaced the order of the columns in a way you want them to appear in the table control. So similarly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that for the next field. I'm going to remove this. Instead, I'm going to bind it to the last name. Next, I do not need the survey ID. So I'm going to remove this field. And then instead, what I'm going to do is I have the first name, the last name, the favorite skill. And then I need the days of the week spent. So I'm going to replace last name with days of week. And here in this case, you might want to change your header slightly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that and say days spent per week. So the last column that we need here is the response ID. And I have changed the name to response key. So I'm going to change that to response key. There is no need to rebind because it's already existing. And there I have the response key. The other thing that you might want to do would be to format the size of the data in a way that it fits on a page. This is too large. So the other thing that I would want to do is to switch to the styling and then go into the styling of the column headers. Here's the styling of the column headers. I would reduce it to 16 pixels and make them bold and go down to the data columns, which is a column body, and change it to 12 pixels and maybe change the color to something different. And that's pretty much how you build the table control and bind it to the backend data service entity. Here is the problem. If you go back to the data source binding, we have bound it to the entire entity without applying any filters on it. So what's going to happen is the current user will be able to view the records of other users and also view their responses as well. So if I close out this app here, and if I go to preview, I enter Andy Menon. Remember, I want to see only my records, and I go to my responses. Here is the original control, and I can see only my records. But if you look at the control here, the current logged in user can see or view the records of all other respondents and all their responses. So this is not really a good practice to straight away bind an entity to a table control. And for that reason, we have to modify our default binding condition and use something to filter the records to limit it to the current user. So if you go back to this original control that's here and view its data source binding, you will see that it's been modified to use the filter condition. And what the filter condition does is it uses the criteria entered by the user and filters the records from the underlying data service entity. And the filter function returns one or more records that match that condition. So what we'll be doing is replacing the data source binding of this table control to use the filter function and show only the records that are related to the currently logged in user. So coming back to Notepad, let me write that filter expression. So I say data source is equal to filter, the name of the entity. In this case, I say preferred skill profile. This is the name of my entity. And then open brackets. And then you select the field on which we'll be filtering this entity. And that filter will be the response ID. Remember that this is what the user will enter, and the underlying name of that field is response ID. So if I click preferred skill profile, this is the name of that field. So I go to response ID and then the field, comma, starts with, comma, and the variable that is used by this form, and the name of that variable is close bracket, close bracket. If I translate that condition, it says response ID starts with, this will return a single record, a single exact record. The same condition when written this way will return multiple records that begin with therefore, with one filter condition, we have conveniently made it possible for us to return a single record, an exact record, or multiple records for that user. So going back, table control, and I'm going to click on this, go to the beginning of this condition, invoke the filter function, open brackets. We already have the entity name, so navigate to the end, comma, open bracket, and the name of the entity field is response ID, comma, starts with, comma, the variable that is used by this form, and that is the var input lookup key, close bracket, close bracket. So the point I'm trying to make here is it's never a good habit to bind your table control directly with the entity. Always have a filter condition so that you can protect the information and not have it exposed to anyone who's not supposed to look at those records. So if I close this out, save my changes, and preview, repeating the exercise. And here we have both table controls returning the same number of records for the currently associated user. And there we have it. We have created an interface that will enable the user to look up their responses in the UiPath app. And it is very important that you give due consideration to the conditions that you will use to bind the table control with the underlying data service entity, because this has several implications, one being data security and compliance, and the other being the performance. That's all for this video. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.